Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are rolling up our sleeves to systematically unpack a piece of media that has been going absolutely viral. We're looking at a recent breakdown from the Freedom Insight channel that makes some very specific, highly explosive allegations about the Los Angeles mayoral race and the broader state of California's voting laws. Now, whether you are deeply plugged into California politics or you're just catching up on the headlines, our goal today is to impartially break down exactly what this source is arguing. We aren't here to take sides or validate claims. We are simply here to construct a clear roadmap of the data, the timeline, and the overarching theory presented in their commentary. To do that, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the viral election allegation itself, then we'll analyze the LA ballot data, move on to the late tax measure, zoom out to the context of California voting laws, and finally break down the loophole exploitation theory. All right, part one, the viral election allegation. Let's examine the claims. To really grasp the gravity of this argument, we have to understand the sheer scale of the claim being made. The source isn't just talking about a handful of miscounted ballots here. They're alleging a massive, systemically engineered framework designed to dictate outcomes. To set the stage, they highlight a very public claim from Elon Musk. He stated, "The election was rigged and fraud is de facto legalized when you ban ID and flood the system with mail-in ballots." So right out of the gate, the source's central thesis is this. It's not about traditional under-the-table cheating. It's about a system where the rules themselves have been fundamentally rewritten to legalize behavior that would otherwise be considered complete fraud. Which naturally leads us to ask, how exactly does this alleged system work? I mean, broad statements on the internet are a dime a dozen, right? But the source argues that to find the truth, we actually have to strip away the feelings, ignore the vibes, and just look strictly at the raw, hard numbers. That brings us to Section 2, Analyzing the LA ballot data. Welcome to the statistical quagmire. Now, what's really interesting about this next piece is the specific data crunched by David Friedberg regarding the LA primary. We're looking at candidates Spencer Pratt, Nithya Raman, and Karen Bass. Notice the incredibly stark contrast in voting behavior before and after Election Day. The source points out that early on, Spencer Pratt was actually leading. But when those late mail-in ballots started arriving days after the election, the math completely flipped. Pratt's share of late mail-in ballots plummeted by 33%. Karen Bass dropped by 10%. But Nithya Raman? She saw an explosive 80% surge in her share of those late incremental votes. The source argues it is an absolute statistical quagmire to try and explain this massive sociopolitical shift purely by pointing to independent individual voter choices. And it gets even more complex. Adding another layer to this data, the source highlights a highly specific geographic claim. According to their analysis, this 80% surge for Raman wasn't just, sprinkled evenly across Los Angeles. Instead, these incremental late votes were heavily clustered right around the Skid Row area. The breakdown suggests that this hyper-concentration in such a highly vulnerable district is a massive red flag. They strongly imply that marginalized populations might be actively targeted in the ballot collection process. Moving on to Section 3, the late tax measure. Let's look at the Measure ER case study. Okay, so if the mayoral numbers made your eyebrows go up, the source argues the voting behavior around Measure ER, which was a local sales tax increase, defies basic human logic entirely. Look at this split. When you look at the in-person and early mail-in voters, they overwhelmingly rejected raising their own taxes. I mean, the cost of living in LA is brutal, and working families basically said no thanks. But contrast that with the late mail-in voters. This is the exact same batch of heavily concentrated late ballots that swung huge for Nithya Raman. This specific group, they overwhelmingly approved the tax hike. Over 80% of them voted yes. To put that into perspective, this measure pushed the LA County sales tax from 9.75% to a staggering 10.25%. We all know how expensive a basic trip to the grocery store is right now. So the source asks a very blunt practical question: what working-class person voluntarily votes to make their own milk and eggs more expensive? They argue that it just isn't natural human behavior for struggling, rent-paying residents to inflict that financial burden on themselves. Their conclusion? These votes were, quote, manufactured somewhere and dropped in late. Which pivots us to Section 4, the California voting law context. Let's look at how the rules were set. So the obvious question is, how is this even allowed to happen? Well, the source emphatically states that no actual rules were broken because the rules were systematically rewritten. Let's trace their timeline. They argue the architecture for this system started back in 2016 with Assembly Bill 1921, which legally permitted unlimited ballot harvesting. Just 18 months after that, universal, permanent mail-in ballots were established. Every registered person gets one automatically. And in the years that followed, registration laws were tweaked to remove proof of ID and citizenship requirements. They even point out that something as simple as a gym membership could theoretically suffice. Now, to really grasp the core of their argument, we need to clearly define that first point on the timeline. Ballot harvesting, as defined by the source, is the completely legal practice where a stranger can collect hundreds, even thousands of ballots from individuals they have absolutely zero relationship with and just turn them in. The breakdown stresses this over and over. This isn't some wild conspiracy theory happening in the shadows. This is the actual codified legal structure of the state. When you stack these laws together, the source outlines a 3-step incentive structure. Step 1, tens of millions of unprompted ballots flood the state. Step 2, because ballot harvesting is perfectly legal and literally limitless, well-funded third parties with specific interests can just swoop into the vacuum and legally collect them. And Step 3, these ballots are legally counted even if they arrive up to 7 days late, with no postmark required, no ID verified, and absolutely no established chain of custody. Their stance is that this creates a perfectly legal, well-oiled machine for mass ballot manipulation. All right, final part, Section 5. The loophole exploitation theory, the legalized mechanics. Tying all this data and legislative history together, the source highlights commentary from David Sachs to explain the ultimate purpose behind these mechanics. This quote really hits the nail on the head regarding their overarching theory. The system is operating exactly as intended. You appoint one, you construct the results. The viewpoint being presented here is that you're not actually electing leaders in California anymore. Instead, interest groups are using these massive legal loopholes to mathematically construct a result. They are effectively appointing their chosen candidate, just under the guise of a free election. And if you're wondering, would groups actually do this? The source points to a documented, proven history of billions of dollars in fraud across other state systems. We're talking Medicaid, unemployment, EBT, hospice care, and what they call the homeless industrial complex. The breakdown poses a really aggressive rhetorical question here. If these same NGOs and interest groups are already ruthlessly exploiting the state's financial systems, why on earth would they suddenly grow a conscience when handed millions of unsecured, legally harvestable ballots? But wait, what happens if someone actually wants to, check the math? Well, the source claims the state anticipated that too. They point out that Governor Gavin Newsom signed legislation making meaningful post-election audits nearly impossible to conduct in California. They describe this as essentially bolting every single exit door so nobody can peek inside. The perspective is simple. You don't lock the door from the inside if there's nothing to hide in the room. They argue that legally removing the ability to verify the vote is the absolute final piece of the puzzle in this engineered system. Which brings us to the end of the source's breakdown, and it leaves us hanging on a pretty massive, unresolved question. If these data anomalies are really as glaring as presented, and the laws deliberately allow for untraceable ballot harvesting, will any of this ever trigger a federal audit? The source stresses that working-class voters are the ones ultimately getting steamrolled by policies they explicitly voted against in person. It really leaves you wondering, will the national spotlight ever crack open this California machine, or will this loophole-driven framework just remain the legally protected normal? It is certainly a lot to chew on. Thanks for walking through this explainer with me today, and as always, keep asking questions.